Well, hey, City Coast friends, we just finished up our Turning Tables series, and we've really been kind of Bible nerding out a little bit over the last few weeks as we've moved from Mark 11 to Mark 14, and we're preparing for these next few weeks to celebrate our first Easter together. But as we looked at this Holy Week, beginning really with the triumphal entry in Mark chapter 11, we were talking about how Jesus was turning the tables. He had really given away all of his advantages when he came in to Jerusalem riding on a donkey like a king to shouts of Hosanna. And he was really allowing almost like all the things that he had built up in his kind of public ministry, but is maintaining some private distance. He really gave away all of those advantages and he put everything on the table. And it was by the end of that week, his opposition had really eliminated it. If it was a game of chess, it was checkmate by the end of the week, and the king had been taken off the board. But we know how Easter Sunday goes. Jesus puts that king back on the board because Jesus was determined to die so that you and I could live a larger story. And that's what we talked about from Mark chapter 11 in the first week of this series. In the second week, we talked about the temple interactions that Jesus had throughout this final week. And Jeannie Smith was teaching us that day. And that's where we really get the literal turning of tables. Like Jesus had flipped tables over in the temple, and he was reframing and resituating everything in these kind of debates with the religious leaders. And he was kind of showing all of them what he was doing and where they were off. And he was not just literally turning tables, he was also figuratively turning them. And Jeannie talked about how the month of March really comes in like a lion. And that's what Jesus did. He came into the temple, he came into these interactions like a lion, but by the end of the week, he goes out like a lamb. And it's just like the month of March comes in like a lion and out like a lamb. Jesus did the same thing as he came into the temple throughout that week, turning tables and flipping all these debates and things on their head, and then ultimately laying down his life at the end rather than claiming that authority as a king. In the third week, we talked about the Olivet Discourse, which is Mark chapter 13, some of the apocalyptic teachings that Jesus gives in this last week. And he talks about how the temple was going to be destroyed. The tables were going to turn, and the temple, the centerpiece of Israel's worship, was going to be utterly decimated. We know that happens in 70 AD. The destruction of Jerusalem also coincides with the destruction of the temple in the Jewish-Roman wars. But what we found was that Jesus had already kind of reframed how people think about the temple and how we think about access to the presence of God. Jesus had said that his body was a temple and that they could destroy it, and in 3 days it would be raised up. And so Jesus's death and resurrection change our access to the presence of God. No longer does one person get to go in this one space in this one building, but now the presence of God is accessible to everyone, anyone who hungers for it. The peace and power and presence of God is accessible to anybody who hungers for it. Jesus had turned the tables of access to God's presence. And then we found this past week, as we talked about the Last Suppers, the final kind of night, Wednesday and Thursday of the week before we get to Good Friday, the final nights where Jesus is reclining at the tables with people. He's continuing to reframe how they're going to gather and how they're going to remember his life. And he takes the Exodus story, the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and he completely turns that into a narrative about himself where they can celebrate and commemorate this event that's about to happen, his death, his burial, and his resurrection. And so he says, this is my body, this is my blood, this is a new covenant that I'm bringing, because it costs Jesus everything for us to live a larger story. And so that's how we kind of turned the tables, and how Jesus had turned the tables, and how we kind of framed up this series leading up to Easter.